Hello there, everyone. I'm your host, the Sea Monster, and I welcome you all to my first impressions video on Godzilla Kong the New Empire. Or is it Godzilla X Kong the New Empire? I mean, the X is, I guess you could say the X is silent, but anywho, so this will be a bit of a unscripted video here. It's really just kind of my overall raw thoughts going on here that will become much more refined and more properly marinated as time goes on, as I get myself acquainted with this movie more as time goes on, so that I could give a potentially a proper essay video down the line. So, Godzilla minus one. So anywho, Godzilla Kong New Empire obviously is the sequel to Godzilla vs. Kong. Very much carrying over like a lot of the tone and overall vibe, if you will, from GVK. Considering it's Adam Wingard coming back to do this one, making him the first director to kind of make a more consistent appearance throughout the MonsterVerse. After seeing the likes of Gareth Edwards, Jordan Vogt-Roberts, and Michael Dougherty in the past only having done one MonsterVerse movie each, the plot is extremely as straightforward as you could possibly get. It's when they pretty much say that this film was gonna be somewhat of like a Showa era Godzilla movie for the just kind of made in a more modern sort of overall look. They pretty much weren't exactly kidding, because we got ourselves a bit of got the Scar King and Shimo. Well, mostly the Scar King, which is this new threat that's about to threaten the surface world, if you will. And so it's up to Kong, who finds out about it, to try to team up with Godzilla in order to stop the new threat. All the while, we have, you got the human side stuff with Dr. Eileen Andrews, her adopted daughter Gia, Bernie Hayes, and a new character played by Dan Stevens named Trapper, who is a Titan veterinarian. And so, that's kind of what we got going on here. It pretty much, it definitely sort of follows a bit of like this Showa era style formula where we establish like a threat of a new monster coming up that's about to threaten the world, and so Godzilla or whatever protagonistic monster shows up to try to intervene and thwart the threat, to try to quell it. And it's pretty straightforward to that front. Obviously, this film being set in the MonsterVerse, it sort of like has the more modern sort of look of it with CGI as opposed to summation, and we also have the fact that there's also some new lore being added into the mix of the whole thing, which mainly involves Gia and whatever plot element that she is sort of tied in that becomes relevant in the later portion of the film. And so, coming out of this movie, first seeing it in the theater, I pretty much would say that I certainly had fun with the film. As like a big, kaiju spectacle type of thing. Well, I definitely would certainly agree that the CGI, the quality of the CGI in this film, did sort of, take a bit of a step backwards a bit compared to other MonsterVerse films. Even arguably GVK, which over time I have kind of started to see more and more problems, especially in light of like a stream that I recently hosted, where we kind of discussed GVK leading up to the release of this film. But for the most part, I would say the action scenes were very well done, even though one would have to potentially, even though in order for the enjoyment to happen, one would have to just kind of still would potentially, maybe not even, in order for the enjoyment to be had, it's very likely that the film very much does not want its audience to really think about like how many people are like getting killed by the Titans that are going on, especially when we have like our big 4-way or 5-way monster fight happening in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, where they all suddenly just like plopped on. The city was never even evacuated or prepared or anything like that. The fact, like, pretty much the fact that there's like people like out in that beach alone, especially in light of like of like more recent events, is just kind of interesting. But that's like one thing. But the fact that the city was never even evacuated pretty much goes to show that there definitely was people who were dying. Like there was like a death toll that was like it put easily within the thousands, potentially tens of thousands. So yeah, as much of a grand spectacle as the set piece really is, the action scenes throughout this film, there is that sense of like the film doesn't want you to think about the casualties, the collateral damage that's like on display, even from whether it's from that sequence or even just from seeing Godzilla like charging at Kong in Egypt. The way he's just like as he's swimming up to get to Kong, he's just plowing through bridges and just having waves of water just splashing into the streets. You're just like, man, Godzilla, man, you're just okay. I mean, kind of definitely a bit of a depart. This is kind of the new Godzilla now that we've been seeing since GVK, where he definitely seems to have less of a regard for the little humans around him than even in the first two movies, pretty much. Which granted, it's not like he went completely out of his way to avoid collateral damage in 2014 or King of the Monsters, but here in this film, in GVK and in this film, it's pretty much as if he wasn't even trying. It's like before he even encounters any Titan, like not even fighting a Titan, the fact that he's just going through, it's just, it's not very consistent, especially considering the fact that in 2014, even when he was getting shot at by battleships, as he was rising up from the water, he wasn't retaliating against the military. Even when he was getting shot at, he wasn't like fighting back against the military. If anything, he was actually just kind of like getting hit, and basically the firepower and all that, and the crossfire, just kind of caused him to smash into the bridge unintentionally. The Golden Gate Bridge, I mean. But yeah, that Godzilla is clearly not present here in this film. The fact that, just the way that he's just like that he's like charging at Kong and GXK in Egypt and what have you. It's just like that alone is just like, well, alright. Which I will say, brings us to Kong, who is done significantly better, pretty much, in terms of characterization. Like, he actually, if anything, he has the most characterization in the film that actually holds up fairly well, that may hold up rather well, considering that he's, like, on this journey. He almost becomes, like, a sort of, potential father figure for a new, younger, sort of ape titan named Suko, an adolescent, which at first they're not on good terms. Like Suko just kind of becomes like his guide to lead him to where the Scar King is and his tribe. But over time, Suko eventually becomes like more of an ally to Kong, and they both kind of start to not mind each other all that much. Let's just say. And yeah, I would say like it works pretty well. The stuff that focuses specifically on Kong, like the fact that there's no exposition and there's no dialogue, it's all just done through the visuals. is very well done. Like it pretty much makes me think of the seasons 1 and 2 of Primal. Not to say that Godzilla Kong: The New Empire is as good as Primal, Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal. Like not even close. Like that'd be heresy for me to even say that. But it does make me think of that in a lot of ways. Just the fact that there's no dialogue going on, or hardly any dialogue whatsoever. Any dialogue that's like intelligible, but we're able to tell what the characters are thinking, what they're feeling, and pretty much just kind of what's going on here, which is very much appreciated. Even if Scar King is ultimately kind of a generic sort of villain in a lot of ways, there is at least something like there's the fact that there's like this dynamic between him and Kong, of where he's like the total opposite of Kong. He's like a darker reflection of him in a lot of ways, or at least of what Kong could potentially be, as being like a potential king of his people. Like that, pretty much, it's actually kind of intriguing, somewhat. Even if it's not done in the most elaborate way possible, they're like the fact that they pretty much even do give us even just enough of that. It's very much appreciated, which is why it's very understandable why people say that the monster stuff in this film is done better than, at least arguably, than the human stuff. Not to say that there isn't anything good to say about the human parts of the film, the parts involving the human characters, but they are just kind of there to provide us exposition and do like a lore dump, if you will. That that, to be honest, like kind of makes the plot of this film seem like way more convoluted than it necessarily needs to, which we'll get to in my biggest point. Like probably my biggest issue with this plot, at least in terms of like how it was constructed. So basically, what we got going on is like Gia is seeing visions of what's to come, and we find out that she's able to telepathically speak to other members of the Iwi tribe, which there's another Iwi tribe living in the Hollow Earth, in another part of the Hollow Earth, and they pretty much call upon Mothra to eventually come in and try to help them save the day, to get Godzilla and Kong to unite to fight the Scar King, just based on a prophecy, more or less, with Gia being a key part of it. Like the fact that it was like engraved on like cave walls or temple walls going on, to kind of detail like what's supposed to end up happening. It kind of it just kind of makes it seem like, in a way where there isn't really like in a lot of it's hard to really describe it. Like, how people like sort of complain about the Star Wars prequels establishing like Anakin Skywalker being prophesized to be like a chosen one. That's what this movie was sort of trying to do. What this movie ended up sort of doing. Minus the obvious subversion of Anakin becoming Darth Vader, pretty much. I'll just say that much. I definitely somewhat appreciate that the Iwi are able to like communicate each other in pretty much ways that in a way that obviously in hindsight, when we look back at something like Kong Skull Island, it's like, all right, well, they could be telepathically communicating each other, pretty much. But in the perspective of Kong Skull Island, we don't really know that. Now, obviously, that's not a thing, but that wasn't even a thing because it may not even been the intention whatsoever, in Kong Skull Island. It probably wasn't. But with Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, pretty much, it does kind of say the fact that there is like some potential room some wiggle room to include this element in there into the world building, involving the Iwi, and I guess you could say I do appreciate. So I don't know how people would feel who were disappointed that the Iwi tribe were on Skull Island were pretty much essentially wiped out, aside from Gia, who was like looked after by Kong and by extension Eileen Andrews. Um, I don't know how they would feel about this sort of establishment of another sect of Iwi being around in the Hollow Earth. Like it'd be, but perhaps some may potentially find it to just be like, oh, so you could have just mentioned that you didn't mention that the whole time, pretty much. Or some could be at least like, well, okay, at least the Iwi are still around, somewhat, and potentially even serve as like a somewhat of a infant island sort of stand-in, considering that they call upon Mothra, which I will say, as good as nice as it is to see Mothra in this film and given like another thing to do after her admittedly limited screen time in King of the Monsters, I will say it's a bit contradictory to a certain part in the, like, basically during the end credits in King of the Monsters, we see newspaper reels showing like about a massive egg that could be potentially from Mothra, just kind of discovered. Like that just kind of appeared out of nowhere. Like the way Mothra just sort of appears in this film, it's kind of unclear like where that connective tissue was, if there was any. Like, did that egg hatch at some point as a larva, and did that larva like end up in the Hollow Earth, and it just so happened to have never been documented by anybody from Monarch or what have you, after the fact, and so that she would end up getting all the way to this place in the Hollow Earth, the subterranean part of the Hollow Earth that's uncharted, where the Iwi are. Like, is that, there's definitely a bit of confusing elements to it, for sure. That, like, which is going to be hard to know whether or not it will even remotely be tied back to or explained properly going forward, because it wasn't really this time. So you pretty much have that going on. And so we are kind of like brought to like the biggest issue that I would say I have with this movie, and no, it has nothing to do with the fact that Godzilla is like sleeping in a coliseum in Rome. The fact that Adam Wingard was like inspired by seeing his cat sleeping in a cat bed, and it's just making him think of Godzilla sleeping in the Coliseum. No, it's not that. No, not that thing. Although it is kind of like, I understand the sentiment because I am a cat person, but I don't know if I would necessarily use that as like inspiration to be like, you know what? I just want to have Godzilla do this thing that's kind of cute, just because. Because why not? I don't know if that's necessarily like a great, like, that's not really a great way to kind of do things, especially given the world building implications going on, by the end of this film, which, yeah, like, let's just say God's, like, what, especially by the end of this movie, like, like, there's no reason, like, it would be, I pretty much doubt that a future movie will do it. I mean, we will see what happens, but there would have, at some point, like, I really doubt, like, these movies would have to, at some point, acknowledge, like, actually seriously acknowledge the collateral damage that's been going on, in these MonsterVerse films, especially by the end of this film, where literally a bunch of Titans just got flung out of a hole in the ocean, over in Rio, and the city, basically just annihilating us, having a city getting totally annihilated that was completely unprepared for such an event, such a catastrophic event to happen. Like, there has to be like another movie that has to like acknowledge it, pretty much, because otherwise, one could end up being sort of like, well, I can't really buy into this as like a world that I could even mildly believe in, pretty much, because people aren't even acknowledging, what's kind of happening, the devastation that's kind of going on, which was something that the MCU did in Captain America Civil War, which, granted, obviously that franchise has devolved into madness and total garbage, but which is why I would like the MonsterVerse to do something like that, to actually acknowledge it at some point, you know, because I don't want it to end up like that. But I mean, who knows? We'll just at this point, like, I pretty much hope it would get acknowledged at some point, but we'll just wait and see. We'll just have to see, and we'll certainly have to wait and see if, depending on how this movie does financially, as of this recording. So, yeah, we pretty much got that. But yeah, the biggest issue going on in this movie, like in terms of how the plot comes together, pretty much, I would say the way the movie, there were rumors before this movie came out about whether or not it was going to be another Godzilla Kong crossover, or if it was just going to be a Kong solo movie, like somewhat inspired by Son of Kong, the sequel to the 1933 original King Kong. I will say there were definitely a lot of elements in this film, even just from this first watch through, seeing it in the theater, where I couldn't help but notice that there were potentially like a lot of pieces in this film that were clearly intended to be that. But because of the success of GVK back when it came out, even during the pandemic era, like, the studio pretty much had it to where, like, they had to include Godzilla in the story somehow, and so that's why we got this whole prophecy involving Gia and Mothra, and, having Godzilla just kind of show up a few scenes occasionally, preparing for, with exposition provided, stating that he's preparing for the upcoming battle by the end of the film. So, yeah, like, it just kind of makes you wonder, like, the Godzilla stuff was sort of added on after the fact, and they had to find some way to work it in, which there have been movies out there have been stories that have done that, they've had to deal with that, and they've done it pretty successfully, but this one was kind of a bit of a mixed bag in that regard, at least on the script level. And that may end up putting it mildly, especially if we were to start to discuss this movie more and more down the line, which we will very much will. So you pretty much have that. And one last thing before we kind of end this off on, and we'll just like talk about some of the human characters pretty much. I mean, I maybe seem to be going a bit all over the place, perhaps unscripted. But Gia is given some stuff to do, like her and her adopted mother, Dr. Andrews, Rebecca Hall's character. They kind of have like some kind of like drama going on where Gia kind of feels like she doesn't belong in certain places, and so when she meets with the Iwi in the Hollow Earth, she kind of seems that way, and so Dr. Andrews is like, preparing for the possibility that she may have to let her go. But then by the end, it's resolved with Gia pretty much saying, "You are my home," pretty much, which is kind of the most obvious thing. The most basic, obvious direction that they kind of could go with in terms of those two. But, what we got here was fine, pretty much. It just would have been nice if we had just a little more of it, perhaps, in order to really, like, flesh them out. Give them, like, a little more to going on character-wise than what we got in GVK. Which, what we got in GVK, at least for Gia, was alright on its own. But, but there could have been, like, potential for us to do more with them in this film, to develop them more. And as far as Dan Stevens and Bernie Hayes are concerned, Trapper Bernie go, their camaraderie is actually pretty, I would consider to be pretty entertaining. I definitely appreciate that Bernie in this film, like, even though he pretty much doesn't come off as prominent in this film as he was in GVK as a character, the fact that GVK kind of wasted like some potential in terms of like him having like a personal character stuff going on in that film as far as motivation to take down Apex in that film, or even the facts that, regarding like his late wife, or the fact that they kind of missed an opportunity, as the Omnivore stated in his video about Bernie and GVK, that there was a huge missed opportunity of a payoff involving him and his flask of whiskey, where he said like the day that flask of, in that film he said the day that flask of whiskey were to go empty is the day that that he's given up on the world, on life, or pretty much. But then that flask of whiskey gets poured down onto the Mechagodzilla computer systems to kind of short circuit him and make him malfunction temporarily, to give Godzilla and Kong just a little bit of an edge in the fight to turn the tide in that film. That scene kind of ends up being kind of more comedic because it's Josh Valentine that does it, and Bernie's like, I have to, oh, that's your solution, I gotta die with you and sober, which is like done in a comedic light, when that scene would have benefited better if Bernie was the one to pour down the flask and it was actually done in pretty much like a less comedic light, where it's like, no, I'm not gonna give up yet, and so he pours the whiskey down himself to because he has some stuff that he's willing to like go forward, pretty much. Like that would have been something, but GVK really dropped the ball on that front, that payoff. Let's just say, so with this film, the fact that he's just kind of there as a tag along, as well as like to play off of Trapper, Dan Stevens' character, as far as like humor, what have you, like there isn't really as much riding on him as a character in this film, so he's kind of like done a little better this time around. Like he's just a guy who's like kind of being like awestruck by everything that he's seeing in the Hollow Earth and what have you. And so, I think Trapper as a character is kind of, was kind of fun as a character. Like Dan Stevens was clearly having a ball playing the character. And the fact that the idea of like a Titan veterinarian, especially, considering that, that there is like a world where there are some Titans that, like Kong, who are benevolent, that they would potentially need someone like him to, kind of like fix him up, like give him a new tooth, pretty much. That which actually kind of works. There is actually something kind of neat about that idea. It's like kind of a neat little bit of extra world building that, kind of livens things up a little bit. But yeah, for the most part, like Godzilla Kong: The New Empire is pretty light, very light in terms of like storytelling, what have you. And the storytelling that we do have there definitely raises a lot of questions, and we may end up seeing more flaws in it going forward. I'm guaranteed that there's people out there who are seeing more flaws in this film than I am right now, and potentially I could end up being like, yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you on that down the line. It's just that while I definitely would agree that this could potentially be the weakest entry in the MonsterVerse, it's still a movie that I personally enjoyed overall, like kind of more or less around the same levels as GVK. But yeah, I would say like perhaps even GVK maybe has like a slightly more coherent plot than this one. Especially if we were to look into things down the line. But who knows? I mean, with this being a first impressions video, we shall wait and see, as time, see how this movie holds up in the test of time, such as will. Because in terms of like how the film, what the film is thematically, what its thematic core is, let's just say it's not very... What I can tell... I haven't been able to... Obviously, with this being a first impressions video, I'll have to, like, watch the movie again at some point in order to really, like, go into it. In order to really, like, dig into it if there is anything. But near as I could tell, it doesn't really seem to be, like, consistent with like what we've been the thematics of what we've seen in the MonsterVerse thus far, like in terms of like like the coexistence with nature and balance. Which I mean, there could be something like that in this film, but but it could even be even more minimal than in something like GVK. Or in terms of like man's the folly of man, like potentially like becoming its downfall, and nature needed to restore everything, and and essentially just kind of like just put everything right by the end, and man has to like learn how to to like work with it, in order to make it better, pretty much to do better with itself. That's kind of what we had going on in 2014. We saw that in Kong Skull Island. We'd seen it in King of the Monsters, and we even even in Godzilla vs. Kong, we saw like just a little bit of it. But in this film, there doesn't really seem to be much of that going on, or really whatsoever. But who knows? Maybe upon further examination, there could be. But for right now, it definitely doesn't seem very apparent. And so, yeah, sorry for this very unscripted video here, but yeah, that's just kind of like my 2 cents on Godzilla Kong the New Empire. It's a film that I definitely enjoyed as like a fun monster action movie, but as far as like how this film would hold up on an objective scale, I have a strong feeling that it won't. But like even in comparison to the other MonsterVerse films that we've got in the past. But yeah, but as of right now, as far as this first impressions video go, writing is probably like a mixed bag at best in terms of like certain details of the world building. Entertainment value is high, but yeah. I mean, like, if you pretty much were to expect me to just, like, actively defend, like, every single little thing in this movie and consider it a masterpiece, that's not gonna happen. We're not, I mean, people say, like, oh, we're not looking for Godzilla -1 again with this film. It's like, well, of course not. Like, we shouldn't, like, that should be, like, an unspoken rule at this point. But, at the same time, even a movie like this that is meant to be going for pure spectacle and not much more can still have like a solid script, at least. Like there can be why not have like a good balance between a script that is both solid and coherent and consistent and internally consistent with the world that it establishes, as well as the world that's established leading up to it, if it's a sequel in that case, while still being a bit of escapism. Like escapism can still have, can still be internally consistent. Like we should all sort of strive to do that. But yeah, I definitely have some mixed feelings on this film in certain aspects, but I don't think it's. I pretty much definitely still enjoyed it overall, but but that being said, I could certainly see more and more issues come up with this film upon further discussion on it, to where I could be like, I completely understand someone not enjoying this movie as much as anywhere near as much as I do. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on Godzilla Kong the New Empire, or at least my first impressions on it. Again, sorry for the unscripted nature of the video. Just figured people would like to know what I thought of it, for in a very convenient period of time. And so, yeah, obviously over time I'll be trying to visit this movie more and more and look into it more and more, and eventually put out an essay video for it down the line. Though I will say, unlike -1, I don't really think that the essay video will be quite as positive as that one will end up being. At least the vibes will be. At least that's the trajectory of how things are going to go down the line. But again, we shall see. So anyways, once again, um, so anywho, with all that said, I would like to thank you all very much for watching or listening to this video. Um, so if you've seen Godzilla Kong the New Empire, feel free to let me know what you thought of it. And yeah, and definitely check out the rest of all my other videos that I have going on. And I hope you all found this and my other videos, worth your while enough to subscribe and wait and pretty much wait in anticipation for more content down the line. Whether it's another essay video, which I promise I will get out very soon, pretty much, or a new stream. Which, speaking of which, I'll be putting a plug in for my new live stream series called See Monster Live. I pretty much hosted my first ever stream. It was on Godzilla vs. Kong, about a day or a night or two ago, as of this particular video. And so I recommend checking that out, and pretty much just kind of wait in anticipation for what is next to come. I will be sure to signpost what I'll have coming up. So stay tuned for all that good stuff. But until then, thanks for watching, and I will see you all later.